Goedenavond allemaal en welkom bij BOZAR. Bedankt voor jullie talrijke aanwezigheid. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci pour votre présence en cette fin d'après-midi in het naam van het Paleis Wiskunde, Kunsten en Cinematheek. Heet ik u van harte welkom bij BOZAR voor de masterclass van Egoyan. De masterclass zal geleid worden door Mario de Barognan. Ons gast is dus vanavond Egoyan. Donc alors l'invitation lancée à Egoyan, c'est évidemment une invitation lancée à un grand cinéaste canadien. Donc on se souviendra d'Exotica, de Hill Street, After, de Calendar, des films qui ont marqué sa carrière et qui l'ont rendu public. Mais c'est aussi évidemment l'invitation à un réalisateur qui a des origines arméniennes, né de parents arméniens, et donc aussi une invitation dans le cadre de la commémoration du génocide arménien. Les thèmes sont profonds et lourds, mais Egoyan a pu, par une narration tout à fait novatrice et un esprit ludique, nous les raconter avec une certaine légèreté.
Yes. So thank you, Atom, for being here tonight. As you know, we're going to speak in English. I hope it's fine for everyone. Tonight, your film Arat's going to be screened, the film you made in 2002, so 13 years ago, which is, of course, fully in line with what we are, commemorating this year. So the film is dealing with the Armenian genocide. Of course, we will talk about Arat later on during the talk. The thing I would like to say about this film that deals with remembering and representing the Armenian genocide is that it seems that it is one of your most ambitious projects, also one of the most frontal and explicit about this issue. But somehow it feels almost as similarly as very expected, but also as a surprise in your filmography. So what I'd like to do first, if you're okay with it, is to go back in time and asking you, what brought you, after 20 years of making feature films, but also short film, video installation, a lot of different projects, you finally decide to embark on this difficult project. So yes, maybe a bit about the chronology of how you came there. Yes. Oh, it's not on?
Okay. En anglais, okay. Well, before Ararat, I think the idea of Armenia in the films was more abstract, for sure. Even though there was a film shot in Armenia called Calendar, and there was explicit mention of Armenia. In my mind, there was something about the culture that was very undefined in terms of the people who were watching the films, that they wouldn't necessarily locate the history and the details of that very extreme history. So when we look at early films like Next of Kin or Family Viewing, I would say The Adjuster, Calendar, there is many references to Armenian characters, Armenian culture, Armenian language, but it's never really put front and center. And I was quite happy with that, actually. It was a very comfortable place to work because it was dealing with issues of identity and the other, this question of having been forced into an exile. Sometimes the exile was really representative of a character or of a space. But what happened with Ararat was really two things. First of all, the film that I made before was called Felicia's Journey. And Felicia's Journey was an adaptation of a writer I loved a lot called William Trevor. And he's an Anglo-Irish writer. That is to say, he is Irish, but he works mostly in England. And there was, in this film, this history of violence against the Irish from the English point of view. The main character, Felicia, her great-grandmother, who speaks only Irish, Gaelic, to her, is talking about this time of the Easter Rebellion. And there's a conversation she has with the father in a castle, destroyed castle, where he's talking about this terrible event when many Irish intellectuals were gunned down and there was terrible violence, and he remembers it as though it was yesterday. And at this moment, as I was shooting this scene and I heard the father say this date, something stirred in me. I was thinking how crazy it is that we're talking about the same period, 1915, 1916. We're talking about something that is that long ago, but yet is very present in these characters' mind. And I thought it was strange that I was dealing with this history and I hadn't dealt with my own history.
And also that it happens in the rooms, like in Calendar, right?
Yes.
They're also moving in this monument thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there was a conflation there of these themes, and I felt that there was a necessity for me to take it. But then there was something even clearer, which is that there was an evening honoring me at the Armenian Community Center in Toronto, and they asked to have someone introduce me, and it was my producer, one of my producers, Robert Lantosh. And he got up in front of this crowd of Armenians, and he took a moment and he looked at them, and he said, you know, as a Hungarian Jew, I have seen many films about Holocaust, and so much of what I've learned about Holocaust has come from these amazing works of cinema. And I'm prepared to say now, in front of his community, that if Adam is ready to make a film about the genocide, I will support it. And suddenly everyone started clapping and getting on their feet. And I just went, oh no, no. Like I was thinking, how am I ever going to live up to this? And then he said to me, after, he said, okay, here's the condition. It has to be done in 2 years, because he had access to this fund and it was going to go away if we didn't make it in 2 years. And I said, Robert, that's crazy. How can I write a script? This is a massive topic. And he said, well, this is the condition. In my early 20s, I had written this historic film, which, because I was a student of international relations, and I was obsessed with the Armenian question, especially after the First World War, the Paris Peace Conference, and how it became this real issue for the Western powers at that time. And then it disappeared, of course. But in my research as a student, I came across this book by Clarence Usher, who is an American missionary stationed in Van. And I wrote this historic piece, which was based on his experiences. And I put this into a drawer, and I didn't think about it forever. And then when Robert gave this plan, I took this script out and I read it. And I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. But I said, it's not really talking about what I feel. I mean, I'm not thinking about this in terms of a historical drama. It's not that interesting as a historic drama. What's interesting is the denial, is the fact that all these years later, now 100 years later, at the time it was not 100 years, it was 88 years, we're still living with this constant denial by the perpetrator. And I felt that this had a very strong distorting effect on the Armenian soul and the ability to actually understand and perceive this trauma. So then that's how Ararat evolved. I dealt a lot with this idea of suppressed trauma in these other films, and this notion of abuse and dealing with recuperation and trying to reclaim your own dignity after an abusive situation, familial or otherwise. But suddenly I saw that this was actually a classic abusal case where there had been denial by the perpetrator, and this would have an effect. And I started thinking about not the film that I'd written, but an imagination of a making of the film.
Yes.
And this was not just a perverse idea, though many people have criticized it as being perverse, but it really was a way of trying to understand the different generations. And we'll talk about that when we introduce the film, maybe, because the film is about the 4 generations since the trauma. You're looking at a survivor, you're looking at the child of the survivor, grandchild of the survivor, and great-grandchild. And these 4 generations intersect in a very unusual way in the film. But from the beginning, that was the project, was to try and understand how trauma is transmitted from one generation to the other. And also to look at the troubling realization that just because you have been the victim of denial doesn't mean that you're not capable of becoming a denier yourself. Much like someone who has been abused might become an abuser, because it's a terrible way that this type of violence can actually flow within us. We inherit it, we learn it, and we actually become perpetrators ourselves. And this is one of the troubling aspects of one of the characters in the film.
Talking about this troubling aspect of indeed this legacy, this heavy legacy that you indeed deals through, I would say trauma, but also what we call transgenerational trauma, right? When a trauma gets transmitted from one generation to the other. You mentioned at the beginning Calendar. Calendar is your first film that deals also in a frontal way, in a very explicit way, with Armenian identity, right? And Armenian diasporic identity, or we call it also nowadays Armenianness. But in this film, you don't deal with the genocide, right? Or, of course, maybe very implicitly.
Well, there's one oblique reference when the woman who is organizing my escorts, she leaves a message on the phone, and I say, today's April 24th, I'm in the dark room all day. So that's the one reference to the genocide.
And indeed, all these references have always been very elusive before the project of 2002. And somehow, at least that's how I read your work, I always felt that it was always there, but it took some time in order to get there. And also, I suppose for you as a filmmaker, as you said, I mean, the reason why it's film within the film, it's also to reflect on what does it mean for a filmmaker, right, to represent the genocide. You also said, talking about Calendar, that in most of your films, there are always Armenian references. I mean, if you look at the name of the characters,
yes,
right, in every film there is somehow something of an Armenian name, right? If you think of the music, I mean, the music of Exotica, there is a lot of Armenian component in the music. And also a lot of visual elements. And so I was also wondering, is there also some, I mean, it's a question I suppose you often get, is there something autobiographical? Because it feels like, for example, Van in Family Viewing, or I would even say Peter in Next of Kin, your first feature film, or Rafi, of course, in Ararat, or even, Simon in Adoration, a most recent film you made in 2009. There is always this self-reflective moment when the character is actually wondering who he is, where he's coming from. Is there something of an autobiographical?
Oh yeah, no, because I'm a very unusual case. I was born in Egypt. When my family moved to Canada, my parents decided to go to the West Coast. My parents are painters. They had met at art school in Cairo. They had the same teacher, very well-known Armenian teacher, Ashot Zoryan, who was a very well-known figure. My father was, I think, the youngest person ever from the Middle East to get a full scholarship to go to the Chicago Art Institute at the age of 16, 17. He had his first one-man show in Cairo. It was a huge success. And he was written about everywhere, in Europe as well. Got this scholarship, went to Chicago, and arrived at the beginning of, or not the beginning, in the heart of abstract expressionism. So he became consumed with this, went back to Egypt, and basically he was ridiculed by the community. You know, they said, you went to America to learn how to paint like a child, you know, like, and this was very traumatizing for him. And he began to sort of think that the community was somehow insular and could not really deal with modernity, I suppose. And so when they came to Canada, he decided with my mother to break from the community. So all my relatives went to Montreal. All my family, like many Armenians who came at the time, are in Montreal, later in Toronto. And they went to Vancouver, and then they went to Victoria. I mean, so this is a tiny town on the west coast on Vancouver Island. We were the only Armenian family there. So it was really almost a forced exodus they made from the community, to be away from the community. My grandmother was with me. She was a very important figure in my life because she we only spoke Armenian, and she was my only connection really to that culture because there was no English. But then when she left to go to Montreal, the process of complete assimilation began. And I wanted to be like an English kid, like desperately. Like I wanted to be English more than anything. I hated my name. I hated, you know, everything to do with any ethnicity. And my parents were not necessarily the type that would, you know, enforce that. Yes, there was Armenian food. It is my mother tongue, but we never spoke it except if we didn't want people to understand something. It was like a secret language, which still is how I speak it with my wife for the most part. My Armenian is very poor. So it was something, though, then something happened which was very interesting. My parents went to Soviet Armenia when I was about 14. When my father came back, he was not the same person, and I would say has never been the same person. He went to the monument at Tsitsana-Berd, which is the genocide monument, and he had a complete nervous breakdown. That's all we can really ascertain. Like he, to this day, when he talks about what he saw in this place, he can't really talk about it. But he basically, in these monuments, he saw the whole kind of culture and all the things that he had denied himself. His mother was an orphan. His mother really was found in you know, at the age of 6. We don't know what town she was from. She eventually married my grandfather, who was also an orphan, and raised, you know, these 4 kids. And they were basically, they inherited her trauma completely. Though my father tried to avoid it, this moment that he had in Armenia completely brought it back with a vengeance. And I understood that this was also something that had been transmitted to me, like this crazy idea to separate from the community, to divorce himself, to assimilate, that this was actually as neurotically inspired as, it wasn't natural. I was always taught to believe it was a natural thing. It wasn't natural. It was based on this need to escape pain, right? So,
I mean, there is 2 things that strike me in the story you just told. Is you refer to abstract expressionism and the question of transmission. So I have to think of the film you made 7 years, a short film you made 7 years before Ararat, which I think resonates a lot with this film, A Portrait of Our Child.
right.
Which combines all the things you just said, transmission, the trauma, you know, your wife, the language, and of course, you know, the genius of abstract expressionism, Arshil Gorky. So maybe you could say something about how this film, this short film you made in 1994, which, if I'm correct, was not even your idea originally. You were asked to make a film based on a painting.
Yeah, basically, it was a BBC had asked a number of film artists to do a short film based on a meditation on a painting that meant a lot to them. So this painting by Arshil Gorky, Portrait of the Artist and His Mother, meant a lot to me. It meant a lot because I think it's an exquisite work, but also it, to me, is this extraordinary reflection on identity and and also transfiguration. You know, it's based on a photograph that Arshil Gorky kept until the end, when he committed suicide in his studio. This photograph was still with him. He was still working on these two paintings. One of them is at the Whitney Museum, and the other one is at the National Gallery of Art in the United States, in Washington. And it's really a portrait of him posing for this photograph with his mother. And this photograph was sent to his father, Setrag, who had left Armenia to go to the United States and was not really in contact with the family. So there's a great mystery as to how this photograph ended back in Arshil Gorky's hands, because he had very little to do with his father. We don't really know how he got the photograph. But the photograph becomes the basis of this painting. And we, this short film that you're talking about is a letter to our son, whose name is Arshil, and we're explaining to him why he's named Arshil. His mother is explaining in Armenian, and I'm explaining in English. And it's a dialogue between the two of us as we're looking at this image of him
as a baby,
playing with my lens, and then we cut to the painting itself, and it becomes a meditation on this painting. So it's yes, and in that description, and I remember Arshil, when we showed them this film, going, "Oh my God, like how depressing that you would like make, you know, you would name me after a person who had had such a traumatic, you know, like life." However, I mean, it's also a person who's an amazing artist, and we like the sound of the name. Interestingly enough, it's not an Armenian name. Interestingly enough, Gorky himself was born Vostanik Aduyan. When he came to America, he changed his name to Arshil Gorky, and he always said crazily that he was the cousin of Maxim Gorky, the writer. So talk about a traumatized character. So he was a genocide survivor. He never really addressed the fact that he was Armenian. What's crazy is that, from my understanding, he couldn't know Russian because he was raised in Van, brought up in Van. So how you would arrive in New York, full of Russian emigres, say that you're the cousin of this very famous writer and not know Russian, I don't think it probably was believed. But anyway, this was the illusion that he had. And so we're explaining to our son why we're naming him after someone who changed his name. So we're telling him to be proud of this name, but the person who had the name wasn't very proud of who he originally was, because he transformed himself. So,
or maybe protect himself. You know, there are many versions.
There's
right?
many versions, and then it gets even stranger, because after he died, there was all these letters that were found where Gorky is writing to his sister, Vartush, and he's explaining in beautiful Armenian what his identity meant to him, and talks about it in such poetic terms, talks about his painting, talks about his art. We've now found out that these letters are a forgery. They're basically written by his nephew, who basically wanted to create this legend about his uncle. So, you know, the layers of camouflage and the layers of trying to recreate, you know, it's never that simple. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that these characters have been, something has been broken in them, you know, and that's what's being translated. And yes.
No, sorry. Which is, by the way, a recurrent figure in your cinema. You know, a lot of these characters are also playing with identities all the time. Most of your characters.
Yeah, they are. They're people who are. And when you talk about, I mean, I really think that Adoration is an interesting case, again, where Simon, because of it's set in the digital world, we shot it in 2006 or 7, so it was still pretty new in terms of this idea of how far you could go and communicate these new identities and how quickly they would be able to be constructed. But you start with next of kin. You start with a character who is in family therapy. This form of
so the film you made in 1984.
84. Yeah, the first feature. And it's about an English-Canadian kid who is 23, who's completely, has no sense of what he wants to do, is kind of catatonic, and he goes to therapy with his parents. And at the time, I had a friend who worked in a clinic where they videotaped the patients and then had members of the family go and look at the videotape later on individually to see patterns in their own behavior by watching the videotape. And this was an actual process that was used in the early 80s. And this character one day is given the tape of another family by mistake. And it's an Armenian family, and their stories, when they came to Canada, they had a young boy that they gave up for adoption because they couldn't afford to keep him. They've had a daughter in the meantime who's grown to reject their very traditional values. And this boy, watching this tape, gets this idea that he's going to go back, find this family, and tell them that he is their son returning. And he's like tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and they all look like us. And it doesn't look anything like them, but they want to believe so much that they bring this boy into their house. So yes, from the very beginning, there's this idea of the imposter, this person who's pretending to be something that they're not. And many of the characters are involved in that process. And I think many of the times they think they're therapists as well. They take on this role, as he says in that film, that he envies therapists. He envies this ability to try and fit into another family, and that seems so soothing for him. So that you're doing something valuable, but also discovering yourself in the process. But of course, it has other consequences as well.
Talking about all what you said, I have to think of the notion of diaspora, right? Of, you know, Armenians are mostly in diaspora, as we know. And there is this sentence in Calendar that I find that defines what it is. I think it's you, because that's, by the way, the only film where you play.
Yeah, I hate acting, but I'm in this film because of technical reasons, but yes.
Okay. So you, in a very ironic position, by the way.
Yeah.
So at a certain moment, you say in voiceover something like, you know, being here made me realize that I'm from somewhere else, or something like that.
Yes, I say that I'm saying to...
We both from here.
We are both from here, but being here has made us both from somewhere else.
Exactly.
Right.
So maybe you could comment on that, because that's, I think, also it's what characterizes you as an Armenian, but also have this feeling that is kind of in-between position of belonging and not belonging is also the fate of most of your characters in the film.
Well, I think it's because when you are from somewhere else, you have a fantasy or an expectation of what it would mean to be in this place that you think you should be from. That migration back should somehow be filled with a certain meaning. And that becomes more complicated when you're with someone else who might also share your background, but has a whole different reason or a whole different formation. And you don't understand how specific that is until you're both in that place. Mm-hmm. So Calendar is a meditation on that. And I would say that the way my character recoils from what he's seeing basically becomes incredibly closed. It's not really a reflection of what he's feeling, but it's something that he has to exaggerate to explain how threatened he is by how attached his wife now becomes to this place. Mm-hmm. So he would like to share something of what she's experiencing, but the dynamic has put him into a place where he feels threatened by it. And so therefore he becomes hostile. You know, and it is ironic and funny at times how hostile he becomes, because it's like it's beyond it's unpleasant. You know, he's really an unpleasant person. But and what he ends up doing when he comes back to Toronto is also very perverse. I mean, you know, this playing out the trauma through these escorts or prostitutes, these people that he hires. But it's also a sketch for Exotica, which was the film to come.
Just after.
Yeah.
But there is also this thing of indeed playing with identity, playing with the identity of others. There is also, to me, some sort of but I don't want to over and psychologize you as a filmmaker, but also.
Oh, please do it.
But I also
now
have
that we're alone.
I also have the feeling it's every time a meditation on what it means to film, what it means to be a filmmaker, because that's what I find fascinating about your cinema. It's never, of course, it's about telling stories, but it's also about telling stories about how to make a film. Why do we make film? Why do we record? Why do we erase? And so that's also, I have the feeling that playing the photographer was also a way for you to play or to, I don't know, something like playing or not being a filmmaker or accepting being a filmmaker within Armenia, which, as you know, is an imaginary place for all Armenians in diaspora. I mean, if I'm correct, have you been to Armenia before you shot the film?
The year before we had been, briefly, because the story of that film is also very interesting. I had made a film, The Adjuster, which was at the Moscow Film Festival in 1991, and it won the major prize. And at that point, part of the prize was 1 million rubles to make a film in the Soviet Union. So we got, while we were there, we got on a plane to Yerevan thinking, fantastic, we get to make a film in Armenia with 1 million rubles, which was a lot of money at the time. And then over the next year, the Soviet Union fell apart, and the ruble became useless. So it was just this. But the seed was there to make this film, and to make this tiny. It became a very tiny film. But it is this fantasy. But also, you have to realize when you watch Calendar, it was made in 1992 when the country was in a terrible place economically. And we were at these beautiful churches, and we were the only people there all day long. It's empty, the landscape. And it's not really reflective of what the country is like now. I mean, these are now big tourist sites, and they're full of people. But there's something, when I look at the film now, it really says something about that moment right after independence, and the incredible hardship that the country was going through. We were the first Western crew to make a film in Armenia. Wow. Though it seems funny because we were such a tiny crew. But I also have to say something which is really important when you talk about this idea of making images, that when I began in '84, filmmaking was a very hierarchical process. I mean, if you wanted to make a film, you had to buy film stock, and this was very expensive. You couldn't just go out and shoot. And then once you made the film, you needed to find a distributor. Otherwise, the film would not be seen. It would not get to anywhere. And in the 30 years since that moment, there's been a massive revolution. I mean, you can shoot beautiful images on your cell phones, and you can distribute them internationally with the push of a button. So the idea that there is something special about making images has evaporated, that there's nothing special about making images. It's become completely everyday.
But it also forced you to think about even more about what do they mean, if it's all possible, What is then your responsibility as a filmmaker to make those?
Well, I mean, I think that's what adoration is about. Adoration is about this idea that you then invest objects with more value, because they are our heritage. They are the things that are actually rare. It's not images anymore. It used to be images. It used to be, a photograph, or it used to be, for me, Calendar is also this meditation on the fact that we had very little money. We had 10 rolls of 16mm film. That's what we took to the country with us. So everything had to be very specifically designed. But what you're seeing are these very composed calendar images. But we also had a video camera. So this is early 90s, and at that time we had camcorders. So you see this difference between the two mediums. When you talk about exile and you talk about the other, I think in these early films, video and the digital, not digital at that point, but the video texture was the other.
Exactly.
That the film image is this image that takes some coordination, it takes a crew, it takes consideration, but you have this other sister process which is incredibly spontaneous and free. And that metaphorically was incredibly powerful in these early films. you know, and this meditation on an image that did not need a crew, that could be done privately, and what that meant the character could explore metaphorically was very interesting. And I think you see it continuing into this latest film, Captive, where it's now become so ubiquitous that the thrill of even hardcore pornography is not enough, that something else needs to be found, and that becomes almost banal, you know, in terms of what's being observed or what it's being fetishized. But something needs to be made rare. In that case, it's the suffering, the specific suffering of certain characters, and being able to document the banal, everyday persistence of their sorrow, which is, yes, maybe a little ridiculous, but I do feel that we're in a place now where if we want the image to continue to have meaning, it will begin to become very distorted, because the natural sense of what an image means has become completely disposable. Like, it doesn't mean that anymore. We can pretend it does. It does not. It can't. We've become, and as we see our younger generation, it becomes even less meaningful. I used to think that, you know, these technologies were about some sort of alienation. It's not really. It's much more banal than that. It's just about relentless observation to the point of it becoming mundane. You know, there's no power to it anymore.
So in that sense, I think your whole filmography show also the increasing presence of technology, right? I mean,
yeah,
because
sure.
your early film, I mean, I think about your first 3 features. It's really about, you know, the alienation, the distortion through technology. And I just would like also to ask you another question related to, you know...
Well, can I just answer?
Of course,
I mean,
yeah.
distortion, but I am Canadian, so
Yes.
we have these incredible media philosophers, like the most famous being McLuhan.
Marshall McLuhan.
Marshall McLuhan. And it's not a question of distortion, it's just a question of being able to understand that technology has different textures, and different types of technology have different effects on the way we communicate. And, you know, he talked about hot and cold medium, which is maybe a little antiquated now, but, you know, he talks about the technology which engages us to participate more, and the one that actually makes us more passive. And that he had a very, very revolutionary approach to this. I mean, he was an extraordinarily important figure in the 60s and 70s. And we also have other thinkers like
Arthur Crocker.
Crocker is very important. Innes is very important. But this is part of our, I think, the formation as a Canadian artist is that you're aware of this, because we're also, as English Canadian, we're right beside America, which is the largest media kind of monster, and we're trying to understand what our identity means in comparison to this huge machine. All of our major cities are right beside the border. So we're all raised on American culture, and yet we're not Americans. So in addition to the Armenian issue, there's this issue of what it means to be English Canadian, which is also as complex.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I think, I mean, you've been, of course, you're very clear, a North American filmmaker, Canadian filmmaker, and that's the reason why you have been compared a lot, at least in the beginning of your career, with David Cronenberg, right? But today I would like to ask you, more, how do you situate yourself within Armenian cinema, Armenian diasporic cinema? And you know more than I do that Armenian cinema in itself is already very complicated, right? There is no recurrent feature. It's a very multiple cinema, multifaceted. I know you have a lot of admiration for filmmakers like Parajanov or Peleshian, but your cinema, of course, doesn't, you know, refer to that, or not explicitly. So indeed, how do you situate yourself within that scope or within that kind of aesthetic tradition?
Well, I mean, you know, when you talk about Armenian cinema, I mean, you also are looking at, there's a huge diasporic master, which is Mamoulian, right? Ruben Mamoulian. And I think that, you know, I've always been in awe of that that journey. You know, being born in Tbilisi, working in Armenian theater in Tbilisi, and migrating to America, and then, you know, being the director of Porgy and Bess, making the first talkies, the first use of color. Becky Sharp was this Armenian guy from Tbilisi. You know, he made Queen Christina with Greta Garbo. You know, he did these landmark productions. He was the original director for Cleopatra before he was fired and replaced, but that was his sort of his last, you know, major swan song. But he was a huge figure and really an innovator. So that spirit of innovation was something I was really aware of. His use of sound, if you look at a film like Applause, and you know, like the sound montage sequences are just so exhilarating. So he's a very important figure for me. But yes, there's this Soviet tradition, starting with Beknazarian, who is also a very important figure. There's a very important Armenian cinema happening in Iran. Some of the first films were made by Armenians. Then you have this whole Soviet period, filmmakers like Malyan, and I would, you know, who did make the first film about genocide, the after effect of genocide, a film called Nahabet with Sarkisian, which I saw quite early on at the community center. There was Bagratov, Venetian. I mean, there are all these Soviet filmmakers. I saw them all in Paris in the early 80s because there was a festival there that I went to, and I met these people. It was very impressionable. But it's true that in terms of influence, it's not really there. There is an amazing film that I would, maybe you can recover, someone here. Andrei Tarkovsky, in one of his periods where he wasn't making films, because he was having troubles with the authorities, was sent to Armenia to be an artistic consultant on a film called Le Pressoir. And it's a film where, if you see it, it's shot in Armenia, but it feels like a Tarkovsky film. And it's kind of this forgotten Tarkovsky movie. So I saw it in Paris, and I don't even know if there's a print of it, but that left an impression on me. The idea of Armenia as a space, those churches, seeing these landscapes, of course that would have an impression on me. But the aesthetic comes really from Bergman, it comes from Bresson, it comes from Buñuel, it comes from, you know, this European art tradition, which I started seeing in my teens, and that excited me about cinema. You know, these Pasolini, you know, these amazing Italian films from Fellini, Antonioni. Those are my direct influences. I love the films of Pelagian. I think that, you know, that those are incredible works of montage. Parajanov's Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors was an amazing work, but of course Sayat Nova is this masterpiece. It's something that we're very privileged and fortunate as a culture to have. You know, even though it wasn't appreciated at the time in Soviet Armenia, it was a scandal. But the fact that this great artist was able to make this stunning masterpiece, which has now been restored, and I think there's a screening coming up, I heard here.
Yeah, it's going to be an exhibition in September.
Fantastic, because this is an amazing piece of work, whether it's cinema or performance art or something very unusual, but it's unlike any other film. And I really urge anyone to see it. You'll be completely overwhelmed. I was. And I would say that film did have an influence on Calendar. Like we were at one point shooting at the church that he shot at, Sanahin, and that was thrilling. I mean, I remembered, you know, we didn't shoot any interiors. I did on video. It's not on the film, but I was shooting in the church, and at one point at Akhbad, the monastery, there's a scene in Calendar, so you're seeing Akhbad throughout. It's the scene, if you know the film, where the books are flapping on the church roof. So those moments were incredible for me because I was making a direct visual link with where this person was. And also, our sound recordist on Calendar did the sound on Sayat Nova. So we had all these stories about
and the flock of sheep, Peletian seasons, right?
Yes, of course. So I would say there are
influences,
references, but the Soviets, you know, that whole tradition, it died. I mean, it's gone now. unfortunately. There was also an amazing documentary tradition in Soviet Armenia, which still, there are people who are practicing that, but it's just, it's difficult to access.
So you will not see yourself as an Armenian filmmaker, but a Canadian filmmaker working with his Armenianness. Is that something more close to?
Yeah, but what you would say then, okay, was Elie Kazan an Anatolian filmmaker? I mean, I think he was steeped in that place. I think, when people say Hollywood has never made a film about the genocide, well, it did make America America. And that's his story.
Elie Kazan,
yeah,
yes,
Elie
from
Kazan, and it's his story of being exiled from this place. There's a scene of an Armenian church being burned, which I used for an installation called America America, a meditation on this image, which was Academy Award nominated film. So he's a resolutely American filmmaker, but still.
But this film touched on his exile as a Greek,
yes,
right? So,
yes, as an Anatolian.
As an Anatolian, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that my identity is whatever you choose to interpret it as. I know where I come from. I have a strong sense of that, and the labels are. I will say this, that my wife would say she's Armenian Canadian, and I would say I'm Canadian Armenian. So that probably, there's that separation where her, she was raised in the community, and that is what you see in Calendar. She was raised in an Armenian community in Beirut. She left at the age of 17, came to Canada, and her formation is first and foremost from within that community. And mine is very much this formation I had on the west coast of Canada. So the Armenian part was something I was aware of, but I immersed myself in it when I went to Toronto. That's when I became very involved with the Armenian Student Association, and it was something that just lit me. It was very important, but my main feeling of who I am is English Canadian, I would say. Yeah.
Sure. Talking also about the film that impressed you. There is a film that I know impressed you a lot, but that you discovered kind of later on in your career, and you made an installation out of it, which unfortunately many of us didn't have the chance to see it. It's called Auroras in 2007. Maybe you could say something. So just.
Well, I can actually surprise you with something. If anyone here, are you connected to the internet? Do you have a projector that's connected to the internet here? Because we remounted it in Berlin, and I've just posted it on YouTube, and so we can see this new version of it, which I'd love to show you, but I don't know if it's possible. Anyway, while we're talking.
We will show it, see it after the class.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, this is an incredible meditation on a film, a silent film that was made in 1918. This genocide survivor called Aurora Mardiganian came to America looking for her brother. Her family had been wiped out. She'd heard her brother might be alive in America. She arrives in New York. An Armenian couple meet her at Ellis Island and say, well, the only way we'll find your brother is if we talk about this to the press. So they hire a journalist. The journalist writes her story. A Hollywood producer reads this story in the newspaper and thinks it would make a great film, approaches her, gets the rights to her story, publishes her story in a book called Ravished Armenia, and then options that to make a film. And 3 years after she's been totally traumatized by this experience in her ancestral homeland, Aurora Mardiganian is starring in a film based on her trauma, where she's seeing Mount Ararat replaced by Mount Baldy in Santa Barbara. She's seeing all these extras dressed up as Turks with fezzes attacking her. She breaks her ankle, but she has to keep filming, and the director says that it's all part of the movie. Don't worry about it. Just keep acting. And then, at the end of this experience, she's asked to go on a publicity tour through America because this film is unbelievably successful. It's now called Auction of Souls, and it's made $2.5 billion in those terms. That's how successful this film was. And 2 weeks into this national publicity campaign, she suffers a complete nervous breakdown. And the producer, in a panic, hires, this is true, all of this is true, hires 7 women who look like her to go across the country pretending that they're her, talking about imposters.
Exactly.
And we don't really know who these women were, but this installation that I did was I chose 7 actresses of different racial backgrounds to recite from her story, from her published account. That was the book I was telling you about, Ravished Armenia. So they take turns telling her story with 7 monitors. And we just remounted this at Berlin because my wife wrote and directed a play called Auction of Souls at the Gorky Theater that was just on a few weeks ago, a great piece that she did. But she also had the idea of putting the installation on outside the theater and in these 7 boxes. And it's quite stunning. So if you go to YouTube and you look Aurora's Egoyan, you'll see it's intercut between the first gallery presentation of the piece and then this presentation outside in Berlin. And you have to also be aware that it's right beside the New Wach, which is the Katie Kollwitz memorial on the Unter den Linden. It's right just literally outside from that memorial. So you have one of the major war memorials, European war memorials, and from that memorial inside you could hear the voice of Aurora outside. So all these things came together and it was quite an exciting installation. So this was a remount of what I originally had done 7 years ago.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just going off on a tangent. but I guess you can all see it now if you go to that site.
But let's talk a bit about, because I mean this film, if you think of it, in 1919,
Crazy.
starring someone who's just been through that, I mean it's unthinkable today.
Yeah.
I mean it will be even unethical. It would not even be.
It would be completely unthinkable that you would, but you know, this is what's interesting about that period is that there was no question of exploitation. In fact, one of the reasons why the film did so well, if you look at the ads, is that it's like, you know, watch young Christian women be raped, you know, like in front of your eyes, like, you know, being forced into harems, being forced into the most awful kind of, you know, and there was this lurid, strange thrill in seeing something that would be unwatchable. And it was censored in many places as well because the scenes are so extreme. We've lost most of the film. We only have images, like 20 minutes have remained. But even from that, you're seeing very extreme sexual violence. But if you look at what was actually in the script, which there's a copy of the original script at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in LA, and Arsene is using that script in her play. It's all about a type of sexual violence that it would be squeamish even today. But the fact that she's also being exploited, the fact that she broke her ankle, and she tells this story, and was forced to keep filming, just shows how extreme this was. There's a book called Ravished Armenia by Anthony Slide.
Yeah, you wrote the foreword.
And I wrote a foreword on it, and it really talks about her as being a super survivor. Not only does she survive, you know, the actual trauma of genocide, but she also survives a Hollywood recreation of it. And then has a nervous breakdown while she's being forced to publicize, only to be recuperated by these 7 strangers, and we'll never know who they are.
But the film somehow got lost, right?
Yes, it got lost because at the time, I mean, I think there wasn't a lot of silent cinema got lost, and what remains, interestingly enough, is not even the real film. It's my suspicion is it's a print that was made for the community. Armenian community, because it's got titles in the beginning in Armenian, and it's also got scenes from another film setting up, it's All Quiet on the Western Front. There's these scenes of World War I that someone has cut in to the film. So, and it's all out of order as well. It's not, it's a bit like, actually, it's interesting enough, when you watch Ararat, someone, a school teacher in Boston at a community center asked if she could have permission to cut the scenes of the historic film back to back, because she wanted to teach her children about the siege of Van, So I said, well, no, you can't. Anyway, she did it anyhow. I mean, so I think people are constantly. It's part of the age we live in now too. Like, not only are images completely ubiquitous, they're everywhere, but they're also to be manipulated by anyone as they choose. I mean, like, there's nothing sacred about a film image anymore. So.
But it also feels that somehow in Ararat, which is mainly a film within the film,
Yeah.
what Saroyan does, so played by Charles Aznavour, it's also, I don't want to say similar to what Oscar Apfel did with Ravished
Yeah.
Armenia in 1918, but there is a return of this sort of graphic violence somehow. But I don't know if it's...
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think that what happens, I mean, whatever happens making this film has disturbed this young man, Rafi, when you watch the film. He's feeling that the film that is being made is compromised, either because it's kitschy or because it's like over the top. Or
so you mean the film made by Saroyan? Huh?
The film made by Saroyan, from what we see of it, is very problematic, I think, in a number of ways. But not the least of which is that it might just be, exploitative, and maybe. But we don't know. We don't see the whole film. But there's a question of authenticity. And one of the things that this young man is motivated by, he works as a production assistant watching these scenes of horror. And he gets very troubled by this. And he makes this crazy idea to go to Armenia, to go to Turkey, and to
Eastern Turkey, yeah.
To go to Eastern Turkey and to recover something authentic. He says that he wants to actually find the images that would give Saroyan's film more authenticity. And it's a crazy journey he goes on, and I won't tell you the whole story because you'll see the film. But this notion of trying to find something that can authenticate and have more meaning because it's actually attached to a real place is, of course, a romantic notion. That's not how filmmaking works. You film wherever you can, but this idea that, and maybe that goes back to a calendar, this notion of going to the source.
Mm-hmm.
If you get to the source, if you're able to film the source, then there's some authentication. There's something that's authentic about that. But of course, what we don't understand is that there's so many personal issues around the source. You're seeing that in calendar. Like, going to the source means, in this case, taking a relationship. And there's the dynamics of a relationship which can contaminate whatever is there at the source. Or there's the sense of where you are as a human being when you're making that pilgrimage. You may not be as receptive as you might think. So there's nothing pure about these journeys because they are susceptible to the human beings we are and to the ways in which we are affected by the people around us. There's an infinite number of variables that will somehow diminish the purity of any authentic experience. And that's just the reality of any alchemy of relationship. But somehow we think that there are these places that go beyond that are so iconic in their placement that they would transcend these issues. And I'm not sure that ever happens. I'm not sure, if you can find that place anywhere that's going to transcend the complexity of being a human being.
But this artificiality of images, I mean, you've been meditating a lot on that, right, from the beginning. But if we think of the Armenian genocide, which is, even though, of course, there is an acceleration of images that with digital culture, but also, of course, with the centennial, it also feels like your obsession with images, if I may put it that way, has also a lot to do with this lack of images that Armenians have. I mean, images in terms of proofs, even though, images are never really proofs of them, but it feels like you want also to show this, this dichotomy of this ambivalence, that images on the one hand are bearer of memory, images give us some sort of access to what is not, to what is gone, to what is lost, but also manipulate, distort, and also are fully constructed and indeed artificial. So I feel there is also some Armenian connection there.
Yeah, but it's also something that has come Yes, there's the Armenian connection, obviously, and when you look at so many documentaries about the Armenian genocide, it's amazing how often they use these images from Auction of Souls, this silent film that's been lost. Often you'll see images that are taken from this Hollywood film and inserted into a documentary as though it was authentic footage. And because it's in such deteriorated shape, it feels authentic, even though it's not. What's amazing is that when someone took images from Ararat and put them into black and white and put scratches on them, it can seem authentic as well. So it's infinitely malleable. But we've understood this from the beginning of cinema. Like this is this was an obsession of Antonioni in Blow Up. You know, like look at what an image can become in your imagination. It's certainly in The Conversation by Coppola in terms of audio recording. You know, this idea that images lie, it really goes back to Fritz Lang. There's an amazing film that he made called Lilium, which he made in France when he left Germany, based on the Molnar play. And for any person who's interested in the notion of surveillance, yes, we use surveillance cameras in Metropolis, but look at Lilium, because he has this incredible sequence where Charles Boyer is meeting Gabriel after his murder, after his death, and he said, "Okay, so you were not good to your wife." And he says, Lilium says, "No, I was always good to my wife." He goes, "Well, come into this room." He takes him into a room. This is 1930. Takes him into a room and plays him a home video of him attacking his wife. And it's got a date on it, and it's got the time. And he says, "Well, it looks like I'm attacking him, but that wasn't her, but that wasn't what I was thinking." And he goes, "Well, we can also do this." And he puts on another button, and it has a voiceover what he was thinking as he was attacking his wife. So, you know, this is Lang meditating on this phenomenon in the earliest days of like cinema. So it's been there from the very beginning, this idea that anything that you present can be manipulated depending on the agenda of the person who's showing it. It's you know, and Walter Benjamin, and you know, this notion of reproduction, and whether or not and how, whatever the context is, it's a given. It's like there's nothing. There's nothing. But what's interesting to me is in the complexity of human relationships, we can now have characters starting in the 80s who are involved in this process of filmmaking, that they become actually, starting in the 90s, quite common. And we're not just talking about people with home movie cameras. We're talking about, you know, people who have ways of archiving their entire past. If you've seen the documentary Waiting for the Friedmans, or, you know, of course, you know, here in Belgium, you have a Man Bites Dog, right? You know, this was an early film.
C'est arrivé près de chez vous.
You know, like, so you have this idea that anything that you do can be observed, and it can be put into a context, and that the act of observing will change the actual moment. There's the, you know, the very famous philosopher Berkeley, and you know, to be is to be perceived, right? That is kind of this mandate, and so that when all perception is cut, self-perception will always remain.
But I mean, if we think of again the context of our today conversation, what I found was interesting, for example, in Family Viewing, the feature film you made in 1987, is that it feels like the video, which is clearly about recording and erasing, seems as a metaphor also of history, how we write and rewrite, you know, cut and paste history. So there is again this ambivalence about manipulation, of course, and as you said, which is almost at the, you know, at the origin of cinema and images in general. Photography, I suppose we can say the same. But still, there is also this idea that we can retrieve things through images, I mean, which is the case of Van. And I also have to think about the way still today the genocide is denied. And, you know, we could put it in a very cliche formula, like there is no images, so there is no genocide. You know, this idea that there is no visual proof. And so I have the feeling that your cinema is always playing with this
Well,
kind
that film in particular has, because you have this character of Van's father, Stan, which it means land, right? Like Pakistan or Hayastan, or like it's a very important word. But his name is Stan, and he can only get sexually aroused by finding his whole home movies and taping over them with homemade pornography. So basically, he puts these home movies of his previous life with a woman who has now vanished, the mother of his son, who he would do sadomasochistic sex acts with. He has recorded all of these sex acts, and he's also recorded all of the family moments on this cache of videotapes, which he's now in the process of taping over with homemade pornography with his new mistress. So that's an unusual character that could only happen in that moment in time. That even now it's become obsolete, because you wouldn't have that physical satisfaction of taking a video cassette, inserting it kind of sexually into a machine, and then kind of being able to then record over it, knowing that you're obliterating history while you're having sex, and that would be a turn on. So that's a very specific character that emerges in the mid-'80s and now has become kind of antiquated and out of date. But there's similar things, I think, that you're seeing in Captive as well, where there's similar perversions of a technology which allow someone to inhabit and put to some sort of test their own moral code in their way. And this is, I think, as a viewer, becomes kind of interesting if you get excited about these things. I mean, there are people who don't read these types of images, and I understand that as well. But if you are reading it, I think that there's a whole other dialogue that happens now in terms of where images go and what ends up happening to them. And the fact that we can just be watching surveillance endlessly, but then we can orchestrate what's happening within that world in very unusual ways.
But go back to family viewing, what you just said about Stan. Interestingly, in this film, so he tapes over, like you say, he tapes himself while he is having sex with his new wife. But what is interesting is that he tapes over video cassette that have Armenian elements into them.
Right, but that is clearly this notion of cultural erasure. I mean, like that he wants to. I mean, there's also this scene, and I mean that's one of my favorite films, as you know. I mean, like I think that's one of the films I'm most proud of, because I was dealing with a lot of issues, but I made a breakthrough with this technology in terms of this texture, which felt so important to me at that time. It's difficult to explain now what videotape in the 80s meant, because not only was it a home video system, but also there was a whole language of soap operas and the way we were watching live cutting, live switching in a television studio. So all of that stuff was conflated with surveillance, and it was a whole soup of different images that were dealing with all of these issues that we're talking about. But erasure is hugely important here, and this idea of a boy retrieving his past, first of all by reclaiming these tapes, stealing them back from his father, and then reclaiming his grandmother. I mean, who's
Armenian grandmother.
Yes,
yeah.
and who has the same name as my grandmother, Armin. So that's a very personal film, and it was based on a fantasy I think I had of recovering my culture through my grandmother. But it was a very, very. I wouldn't have been able to have made that film if that technology didn't present itself to me as a canvas. It was an amazing canvas to have.
Before we speak about Ararat again, I would like to I'm very curious about your latest film, Remembered. I only know the title and the actors.
Yeah, no.
Is it still a secret, or maybe
No. I mean, it's quite an amazing. I can say it's an amazing script because I didn't write it. But it's right up. It's an amazing story. It's about a Holocaust survivor who's suffering from early stages dementia, who thinks he's found the person responsible for killing his family at Auschwitz, goes on a mission to find this person, kill him, but keeps forgetting why. So he finds himself in the middle of a hotel room in the middle of America with a gun, and he doesn't know why. And it floats in and out, like basically and then there's a whole other sort of story as to who he really is, which I won't tell you, but it's quite a remarkable, and it was an opportunity to work with Christopher Plummer again. It's an extraordinary performance, but we're also working with
Martin
Landau, Bruno Ganz, these incredible host of German actors, and anyway, it'll be ready in the fall, I guess. So you'll see.
And that will be your first film, if I'm correct, on the Holocaust. I mean, related to the Holocaust.
Yes, it will be.
And
yes.
is that a coincidence in
Well,
2015?
I have to say, it is an incredible. It's coincidence. I mean, I chose to make the film. I was very aware that it was, 2015. I'm making a film called Remember. It happened to come this year. It also, what is extraordinary is that it is the last film about Holocaust you can make in our day, using the characters that are still with us, because after this point it'll become like a period piece, or so these are very old men who still are, and we're seeing this. I mean, it's amazing in America, these characters who are emerging, who are. America did a very good job of hiding Nazis because they were using them for their own industrial, innovations, and it's quite shocking how this is now coming to light. So it's quite a timely film for North America as well, I think, at this point. So I'm excited to.
And it's a feature film.
It's a feature film, yes.
Okay, and now I would like to move again to Ararat. Of course, we're going to present the film shortly, but just a few. I just would like to discuss Ararat now with this question of, representing what is not representable. This whole question of how to represent as a filmmaker mass violence. Because the film is, obviously it's not a document. It doesn't have any pretension for any historical overview of the event. It's not about the past. That's not what you wanted to do. And I suppose also that's why some people were a bit maybe surprised with that. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the film is about exile. Really, it's about exile, and it's about really, there's two things to say, is that there's 4 generations, as I said. There's a generation of the survivor, played by Arshil Gorky, the painter, who comes back after talking about him. There's the child of a survivor, played by Charles Aznavour, who is making this film about the genocide in Toronto. There's a grandchild, which is Arsene Khanjan, who's a specialist, an academic who specializes in Arshil Gorky, and gets hired to work on this feature film. And her son, Rafi, who comes to work as a driver, production assistant on this film. And he's obviously the great-grandchild of genocide. So those are the 4 characters, and you're seeing them interact in the film. But for the first 20 minutes, you're really seeing 2 families. One is this Armenian family with Arsene and Rafi and the stepsister, played by Marie-Jose Croze. But the other one is Christopher Plummer. And this is probably a little confusing for most people who are expecting a film about the Armenian genocide. The story of Plummer and his son, and a whole lifestyle choice that the son has made. Basically, he's come out, I guess, and he's living with this man who's half Turkish, who ends up being in the film. And Plummer is effectively exiled from his son's life because of the son's sort of paranoia that the father is rejecting him. And this might seem like a completely odd place for this film to go, but ultimately it becomes the center of the movie, as it really becomes this two-hander between Rafi and Christopher Plummer during investigations in a customs office. But what is interesting to me is this notion of exile, that ultimately, you know, we can tell our histories, we can tell our stories, we can make big political gestures, we can have states recognize history, but that history is ultimately transmitted between individuals, between stories that are told between individuals.
And objects.
And objects. and the stories that are told, particularly within families, between parents and their children, between children and their children. I mean, that this is how history is ultimately maintained. It's not in the memorials, I don't think, or in the public places. It's in the very private places. So what I was interested in with Ararat was showing these two families dealing with exile, and ultimately how the fear of exile creates a compassion in Plummer towards this boy, and allows the boy to tell his story in a way he's never told it before, and gives him dignity. So it's a very, for me, it was a very personal film, but it was a strange film to bring out as being the first film to deal with, the Armenian genocide that was widely distributed. Of course, Auction of Souls was widely distributed in 1919, but completely forgotten. But this film came with a lot of expectation, and there was a ton of outrage from the Turkish side, who thought it was a piece of propaganda, and then were confused because it was too complex to be propaganda. And then the Armenians, who probably wanted a piece of propaganda, but were angry that it was too complex to be what they wanted. But it's interesting to me that this film, because of the centenary, there've been a couple. There's been another screening in Europe, in Berlin, a couple of screenings in Canada, in the U.S., and I've been traveling with it, and it really. I think the reason why it still holds is because, first of all, the situation hasn't changed that much, but it's also dealing with something quite rare, which is the transmission of trauma. There was a colloquium about the film at the University of Tel Aviv a few years ago, and it was interesting that in this discussion, like there isn't a big tradition of films that deal with the transmission of trauma through generations. And it's a difficult subject to deal with, because how can you compare the suffering of a grandchild to the source of the horror of the physical violence that must have been endured? And yet, as I think I might have expressed in the story of my father, and these things do flow through, especially when they're denied, especially when there's a history of concealment and a history of silence around it. So that's what the film is dealing with, and it's challenging, but it's also been very gratifying that it did find, fortunately, a great distribution. It was picked up, with Miramax, and they output it through their Disney deal, and it just so unlikely sort of found its feet. But it was very rocky. It was a very rocky beginning. And I'll tell you what's also interesting, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but in the films that have been made since that are the films that Armenians thought they wanted to see, like a more direct historic approach, actually fall prey to what I think I'm saying with Saroyan's film, which is that there is this irrelevance.
So the film within the film.
The film within the film. There's something irrelevant about actually showing something that is not really related to our world today, unless it's done impeccably, unless it's like an absolute flat-out masterpiece. There's no reason for anyone to see that film just because they should, because that's not why we see cinema. We don't go to see cinema because we should see it. We go because we want to be engaged, and that this is maybe the frustration that many Armenians feel, is that well, if someone just said it, no, it has to be said impeccably well, or it has to be done in a way that differentiates itself from a whole history of Holocaust movies, which are extraordinary.
But it's also about this, this complicated thing about always too much and too little, right? When you deal with genocide, you have to accept somehow as a filmmaker that you will never be able to reach the whole thing. I mean, you have to position yourself.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's unthinkable, the level of, well, it's so radically dehumanizing as a process that the act of cinema, by the very focus that a camera gives, is an attempt to humanize. So you have that paradox in the two processes. One which is about complete obliteration, and the other one which is about enhanced perception and focus on the individual. So how do you make that work? I mean, I do think that there have been some extraordinary films that deal with Holocaust and are.
Which one do you have in mind?
I think one of my favorite, and again, maybe because it's dealing with the effect of it, is The Pawnbroker, Sidney Lumet's film. I think it's really quite an amazing film because it's dealing with Rod Steiger is a person who's haunted by this, and we see it in, you know, as he's trying to, you know, go on with his life. We understand the nature of the devastation that he's experienced. So that to me was a very, you know, a very impressive film.
But what I also found remarkable in Ararat is that I have the feeling also that the film shows different films at the same time. So of course there is your own signature, and it's very, you know, recognizable in your whole filmography, but it also gives room to other representation. Of course, by doing film within the film, but also the sequences with Arshil Gorky, which is closer to a sort of document. Then you also have photography, you have amateur footage, you know, the video. So it's like your film also incorporates all different ways and strategies to represent the genocide. So in a way
Well,
I don't know if you agree with that.
I think diaspora is a prismatic experience, right? I mean, the act of like diaspora by its nature is fragmented and prismatic. It's like shards of glass, and you know the way you look at it is constantly shifting, depending on what the configuration might be. And when you're dealing with a people, a dispersed nation like the Armenian nation, it depends so much on the host countries that the community is in, the specific dynamics within those places. I was very aware of this past month, that when I looked at here's talking about the difference between English Canada and America. In Canada, it's recognized. It's been recognized for almost 10 years as a historic fact. So that gives us a very different place than in America, where the American Armenian experience is still waiting for that recognition, that state recognition. And until that happens, it is incredible the game that's being played with the Obama administration, whether or not he's going to use the word, the anticipation that this year he would, and he doesn't. And then meanwhile, at our commemoration, we have the premier, we have the prime minister, we have everyone, and it's very, you feel that, well, this makes us very different communities, radically different communities. And I think about, we were in Berlin with this play that Arsene was doing, and they were saying that there's no way that, that Germany has taken a step back from recognition, and then suddenly there's this extraordinary moment. It happened here, it happened Austria. So there's this, it's a constantly evolving place. But it goes back to what I said before. I don't think that as amazingly and as important as these state recognitions are, it doesn't really locate where the history is, because that is between individuals. That is in the conversations I have with Turks who are enlightened, or ones who are, absolutely in denial, who are furious, who hate me, I suppose, ones who are cautious and, are prepared to have a rapprochement. Those are the places where I think history actually, shifts.
So that's why in your film it's personal memory becoming collective memory. You always start with the personal, or the even intimate memory. Right?
Yeah, I mean, look at the scene that happens between Plummer and the boy at the end in the dark room. Like there's a real process of transfiguration there, and look at what Plummer is saying to his son at the end, the boy who is the young man who has rejected his father. And you understand that so much of what happened that night was based on personal history and personal need for affirmation, what we need to affirm about ourselves. I think this happens in a lot of the films. Like, forget about Armenia for a second. It's all about characters who have been destroyed in some way, or something in their experience has been violent, and they need to assert their dignity. They have to find some way of healing themselves through placing themselves in a healthy place. And what that means, what healthy means, can be very distorted sometimes, and it could be actually wrong-headed. I think if you look at Exotica, this character who goes to the strip club and has a relationship with a dancer, he thinks he's dealing with his trauma, and in fact he's accentuating it. I've said this before, this in psychiatry there's a term called faulty mourning, spelled F-A-U-L-T-Y. Faulty meaning that you think you're dealing with trauma through a process of mourning, but you're in fact accentuating it. You're making it worse. And you have no way of actually understanding that. Someone else has to actually steer you out of this process. So, but there's a desire we all have to make ourselves better, but we sometimes don't understand what is the best way to do that. And our impulse may be wrong. We think we understand ourselves, we think we know what's best for ourselves, and sometimes we don't. But the problem is then, who determines that? And we also can fall into very bad relationships when we think someone else understands us better than we do. And of course that can be manipulated so easily, especially in a familial situation. So these are the topics that I find are very compelling to me.
Thank you very much, Atom, for this great conversation and for this masterclass.
Thank you.
I realize how much we've lost. Not just the land and the lives, but the loss of any way to remember it.
You're a liar.
Everything I've told you is exactly what happened.
All my life, I promised to tell our story. How we suffered. And now we are making this film. What's the story about?
Over 1 million people were killed.